So Rajeshri ji, you can share the textbook.
I'm trying, sir. I've just downloaded it. Let me see
Okay.
if I can. Yeah.
Then I'm making you a co-host. Okay.
Hanji.
I made you a co-host. No problem. अरेहंत सिद्ध सुर उपाध्याय साधु सर्व अर्थ के प्रकाशी मांगलिक उपकारी है। तीन को स्वरूप जानी रागते भई जो भक्ति काय को नमाए स्तुति को उच्चारी है। धन्य धन्य तुम्ही से काज सब आज भयो कर चोरी बारंबार वंदना हमारी है। मंगल कल्याण सुख ऐसो हम चाहते हो मेरी ऐसी दशा जैसी तुम धारी है। हो मेरी ऐसी दशा जैसी तुम धारी है। So we continue with our discussion on sequence bound modification, one of the most powerful principle of Jainism, and it is more powerful with the advent of Kanji Swamiji. It was there in the textures, in the textbooks, it was there in the scriptures, but nobody knew it was such an important. And Swamiji popularized it, and now we can see that every household knows about this principle. Every mumukshu knows about this principle, and it has become one of the most sought after principle when we think in terms of getting tax stress free. Okay, one of the most successful stress booster. So we were on to 15th. We have completed the 15th module. Today we will be starting with the 16th. The heading for the 16th module is पर पदार्थों के परिणमन की चिंता करना व्यर्थ है. Worries pertaining to non-self substances is meaningless or futile. Why it is futile or meaningless? Because it is not in our control. Even the modification of our own, although we are doer of that modification, but we are not the doer of the changes in the sequence of those modifications. So when we cannot change the sequence of modification of our own substance, then how we can do anything in the non-self substance? Okay. So that is all about the 16th module, page number 43. Darshit ji, you read. Or you cannot read now.
Yeah, no, I can read. I've got a printed copy, but I don't have the text on
Okay.
my screen. I can read from my printed.
Yeah.
Okay, Jai
Go ahead.
Jinendra.
Yeah.
The object of the above assertion about sequence-bound modifications is the negation of the capacity of doing something in non-self substances. The truth that a substance does not bring about or destroy the modifications of other substances is the chief basis of Jain philosophy. Every substance is the doer of its own modifications. Change is in its very nature. In that change, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, my
Absolutely
screen is
clear.
switching off. Yeah, okay. In that change, it does not at all need the help of any non-self substance. Like its everlasting nature, changing modifications is also in its very nature, or that modification is the doer of modification itself. You have nothing to do in it. That is, you have not to be anxious about doing anything. The inanimate beings do not do anything in non-self substances. They do not care to have their own modifications. Does that behavior pattern become obstructed on that account? No. Then why does the animate being alone worry in vain about the modifications in himself and other substances? Every substance is completely capable of bringing about its own modifications, or thus modification is completely capable in its own course of modifications. O soul, you have nothing to do in it. You are in vain wasting and harming your own life in that anxiety. You are roaming about with pride, with the anxiety about the course of modification of the substance, which does not need your cooperation at all, which does not care for you. You're yourself feeling restless like the pride-obsessed dog who thinks that if it is he who pulled the bullock cart. The scheme of the nature of things assures you that you should remain carefree about the universe. But this pride-obsessed being, thinking that he can do something in the non-self entities, holds that if the son accepts the responsibility of running the shop, he can be carefree. How can I feel carefree unless someone else assumes the responsibility of the work I am doing? But I say emphatically that there has never been such a son as a sequence-bound modification of substances, who can completely free the action-obsessed father from his responsibilities. He can only become carefree if he understands and has faith in the principle of sequence-bound modification of substances. The problem of the pride-obsessed doer of actions is that somebody should undertake his responsibility to relieve him. He does not understand that he does not do anything in the non-self or its modifications, only entertains anxieties due to ignorance of this scheme of things. As regards these anxieties also, he assumes the part of the doer only, as long as he is ignorant about the course of events.
Stop. So this is the end of the 16th module. We are on to page number 45 now. Next. Yeah. So you see in this particular module, it is being said that a soul is not a doer of anything in the non-self substances. By nature, each and every substance is independent, and each and every substance is in itself fully capable of doing his own work or duties. He does not need any help from the others. Okay. So every substance is doer of its own modification. Change is it in its very nature. In that change, it does not at all need the help of any non-self substances. Like its everlasting nature, changing modification is also in its very nature, or that modification is the doer of modification itself. So changing modification is it in its nature. Every moment there is a rise of new modification, there is a destruction of old modification, and this change keeps on happening all the time. For never a moment a modification stops manifesting it. Okay. So this is the nature of each and every substance, not only soul substance, but all the other 5 substances also. Every moment the modifications are changing of all the 6 substances, and that change is being affected by that particular substance itself. No one else plays any role in the alteration or changes or the transformation that each substance undergoes. So each substance is independent in itself to perform its own transformation. Okay. So this problem is only with the soul substance, because all the other 5 substance, there also the modification changes every moment, but they do not care to have any effect, any change. Okay. The inanimate beings, Ajiv Dravya, do not do anything in non-self substances. They do not care to have their own modification. Does that behavior pattern becomes obstructed on that account? No. Then why does the animate, the soul, being alone worry in vain about the modification in himself and other substances? So the other five substances incessantly performs their duties without any tension, without any anxiety. It is the soul only who takes so much of stress and anxiety in the performance, in the transformation of its own modification, where in reality it is happening on its own. There is nothing that we can do at our end. We are only an observer, knower and seer. We are not the changer of our own modification. When we are not the changer of our own modification, how can we affect change in other non-self substances? So this is something, if we are able to understand this and make a firm decision on this, the same moment you become relaxed. There is nothing on your head to do anything. You, because of your ignorance, believe that you are doing changes. You can alter the course of your modification, but in reality, it is not so. Every substance is completely capable of bringing about its own modification, or thus modification is completely capable in its own course of modification. O soul, you have nothing to do in it. You are in vain investing and harming your own life in that anxiety. You are roaming about with pride, with the anxiety about the course of modification of the substance, which does not need your cooperation at all, which does not care for you. You are yourself feeling restless like the pride-obsessed dog who thinks that it is he who is pulling the bullock cart. The dog is so small and the bullock cart is so big, and bullock cart is run by the bullocks, and dog has nothing to do in it. But because of his ignorance, he takes pride in saying that I am running the bullock cart. So let him say, but he does not become a doer of that bullock cart. That is the truth. Similarly, this soul is only an observer, only a knower, only a seer, but he does not believe so. And because of his delusion and ignorance, he becomes a doer of all the modification that is happening all the time. And he becomes a doer, but he does not become one soul. Everything is happening, every action is happening on its own. There is no doer or any sort of godlike creature who is managing these things. It is everything is in automation mode. All the six substances are doing their own functions independently without taking any help from any other substances. The scheme of the nature of things assure you that you should remain carefree about the universe. But this pride-obsessed being, thinking that he can do something in the non-self entities, holds that if the son accepts the responsibility of running the shop, he can be carefree. So every father is so much obsessed with their earnings and the shop that he feels that if his son takes over the responsibility of running the shop, he can be carefree. How can I feel carefree unless someone else assumes the responsibility of the work I am doing? But I say emphatically that there has never been such a son as the sequence-bound modification of substances who can completely free the action-obsessed father from his responsibilities. He can only become carefree if he understands and has faith in the principle of sequence-bound modification of substance. The problem of the pride-obsessed doer of action is that somebody should undertake his responsibility to relieve him. He does not understand that he does not do anything in the non-self or its modification, only entertains anxieties due to ignorance of the scheme of things. As regards these anxieties also, he assumes the part of the doer only, as long as he is ignorant about the course of events. So long he is ignorant, he will always feel anxiety of doership, of modification, which are in fact happening on its own. There is no doer, okay? But he does not realize this, and in that case, he becomes the doer of those modifications and he unnecessarily feels restless. So this was the 16th module. Now coming on to the 17th module, the heading is Jain philosophy of inaction. Inaction means non-doership, okay? Jain philosophy propagates that each and every soul is non-doer by nature. But because of delusion and because of ignorance, this soul believes that he is the doer. And that is where the karmic bondage happens. And this mundane existence goes on and on. Okay. So we will understand this in the 17th module. There are 4 points to this particular module. The first one, in the first paragraph itself, we have 3 points. And the 4th point is in the next page, that is page number 46. Okay. So first we will read this and I will highlight the points and explain it. Okay. Jinali ji, can you read from the screen or you have a textbook with you? Unmute yourself. Subhaji, you read.
Jai Jinendra ji. Jain philosophy is called the philosophy of inaction. Inaction does not only mean that there is no agent or doer of this world, but also that any one substance does not and cannot produce or destroy the modifications or bring about any changes whatsoever in other substances. Even sentient soul is not the doer of its unnatural behavior and inclinations. This truth has been expressed in the Karta Karma and Sarva Vishuddha Gyan chapters of Samayasar. The commentaries of verses from 308 to 311 of Sarva Vishuddha chapter that refer to sequence-bound modifications have ultimately proved the concept of non-doing, as is clear from the following exposition. This way, an animate being is born of his own modification, and so his cause-effect relationship with inanimate objects does not stand to prove, but because there is no creation-creator relationship between substances. When the cause and effect relationship is not proved, the activity of living entity in inanimate objects stand unproved, and the activity of animate objects in inanimate ones not being proved. The relationship of the deed and the doer without the need of any other object is proved in self only, and thus the process of doing anything in the inanimate by animate stands unproved. Thus, animate being is not the doer of any deed. Conclusion is that the modifications of all substances are different. All the substances produce their own modifications. They are the doers, and those modifications are the deeds. From real point of view, there is no doer and deed relationship of any substance with any other substance. Thus, an animate being is the doer of his own modifications, and the modifications are his deeds. Likewise, an inanimate being is the producer of its own modifications, and its modifications are its deeds. That way, an animate being is not the producer of others' modifications. If some may argue that one may not be the producer of others' modification, but one is the producer of his own modifications, all right, at right. I tell them that this is a fact because each substance is the doer and utilizer of its own modifications. But this does not mean that you can effect any alteration in the future reflection in the omniscient of the Supreme Being. If one cannot affect any alterations, how does one remain the doer of his own modification? Such doubts are raised by people. Because how can one who has regarded doing as making alterations only think ahead of this? Is there no doing without making any changes? Is doing that which is not destined to happen called doing? Is it not doing to do that which is destined to happen? Should I continue, Ji? Ji, should I continue? Ji, can you hear me?
Yeah, continue. Sorry, I was on mute mode.
Doing one's own modification, easy doing or inaction, whatever you call, mean the same thing. When we say that Jain philosophy is that of inaction, the idea is that it is the principle of easy automatic doing or self-doing. It does not believe in doing anything in the non-self of effecting alteration in substances. Doing or happening with ease mean the same thing. Whatever is to happen in the future will happen, and that means we shall do it with our efforts. Self-effort has not been discarded. There is no subservience. Everywhere there is complete independence. This includes all nature, effort, future, inevitability, fruition of time, and instrumental causes. All the 5 essentials are present. Does the soul bring about its own modifications or not? In this context, Sri Kanji Swami explains as follows. Question. Modifications are sequence bound. The modification of the soul also happen as bound to happen. As such, soul is not their producer. Is this correct? Answer. No, that the soul is not the producer of its own modifications is not correct. The soul itself is the doer of all the sequence-bound modifications that take their shape. However, it is necessary to understand here, especially that the person who has faith in the sentience of the soul or who has arrived at the principle of sequence-bound modifications does not assume modification of perverse faith. As such, he is a non-doer of perverse faith. Whatever soft attachment, etc. remain, he does not identify himself with them. That way, he is also a non-doer of attachment, etc. but is a creator of the pure modification of correct faith and consciousness. The tenet of sequence-bound modification does not mean that modifications take form without the soul being their doer. The sentient being, assuming pure sentient modification, is himself their doer, and non-sentient being, assuming perverse modification, is the doer. Thus, each substance is the doer of its own sequence-bound modification.
Stop. So here the module 17, module number 17 ends. And we come back to page 45 again. That's where we start. So the first point is, it starts from the beginning only. Jain philosophy is called the philosophy of inaction. Here inaction means non-doership. Okay, अकर्तावादी. जैन दर्शन अकर्तावादी दर्शन है, philosophy of inaction. Inaction means they don't recognize the doership of anything. Okay, it's a philosophy of non-doership. Inaction does not, this is the first point, inaction does not only mean that there is no agent or doer of this world. By agent, they mean there is no God, no creator God, no manager God, and no destroyer God. Like in Hindu philosophy, they have Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh. So Brahma is the creator of the world, Vishnu is the manager of the world, and Mahesh is the destroyer of the world. So that is there in Hindu philosophy. But in Jain philosophy says that there is no doer, agent, God of this world, but the whole world is running on automation mode. Okay. But second point, now second point start. But also that any one substance does not and cannot produce or destroy or help the modifications or bring about any changes whatsoever in other substances. So this is the second point. Second point puts emphasis on that each substance is independent. It is not dependent on any other substance. It cannot harm. It cannot help. No, each substance is independent on its own and it cannot do anything in the other substances. This is the second point. The third point starts after this only. Even sentient soul means the right believer, the learned scholar, is not the doer of its unnatural behavior. Unnatural behavior means toxic disposition and inclination. So this is the third point. First point was that there is no creator God, doer God. The second one is that one substance does not do anything in the other substance. And the third point is even the right believer. Okay. Even the right believer is not the doer of its unnatural behavior, toxic disposition, okay, and inclinations. These are the 3 points. The fourth point we will discuss in the next page, but you have marked the 3 points. And this is being reflected from Karta Karma Adhikar. This truth has been expressed in the Karta Karma Adhikar and Sarva Vishuddha Gyan Adhikar of Samay Sarji text. Okay. There 4 principles have been mentioned. The whole Karta Karma Adhikar is one of the biggest chapter of Samaysar, and it starts verse number 69 and it goes on up to verse 144. So this is one of the biggest chapter of Samaysar, and in this Karta Karma Adhikar 4 principles have been mentioned. The first one, whether it is ignorant being or the right believer, whether it is right believer or wrong believer, they are not the doer of anything of non-self substances. Okay. Even ignorant being is also not a doer of anything in the non-self substances. This is the first principle. The second principle, the false believer is a doer of attachment. This is the second principle. The false believer is the doer of the attachments. So when we say attachment, it also includes aversions and all kinds of passions. So the false believer is the doer of attachments, etc. The third point, the right believer is not the doer of attachment. And the fourth one, then what the right believer do? So the right believer is the doer of its own knowledge, nothing else. It's just the doer of its own knowledge. This whole chapter deals with these four principles. Okay. The verse number 308 to 311 of Sarva Vishuddha Gyan chapter. So Sarva Vishuddha Gyan chapter is just an extension of Karta Karma Adhikar. There also Acharya have tried to point out the mistakes that this soul makes in terms of doership. Okay. So same thing has been explained in the Sarva Vishuddha Gyan Adhikar also. So this verse number 308 to 311 of Sarva Vishuddha Gyan chapter refers to sequence bound modification, have ultimately proved the concept of non-doing, as is clear from the following exposition. In this particular explanation, the Acharya Amrit Chandra Dev says that soul is a doer of its own modification. Similarly, non-soul is also a division doer of its own modification. There cannot exist a cause and effect relationship between the soul and the non-soul elements. Okay. But from the conventional point of view, it says that the soul is a doer of non-soul elements. But from the real point of view, it is not a doer of anything in the non-soul substances. Similarly, non-soul substance is not a doer of anything in the soul substance. So this is proved in this particular verse number 308 to 311. Thus, animate being or the soul is not the doer of any deed. Okay, doer of any deed means non-doership. Now the conclusion. Conclusion is that the modification of all the substances are different. All the substances produce their own modification. They are the doers and those modifications are their deeds. Deeds means action, karya or karma. From real point of view, there is no doer and deed relationship of any substance with any other substance. Thus, an animate being is the doer of his own modifications, and the modification are his deeds or action. Likewise, an inanimate being is the producer of its own modification, and its modification are its deeds or action. That way, an animate being is not the producer of others' modification. Then, in the next paragraph, if someone may argue, here the fourth point will come, if someone may argue that one may not be the producer of others' modification, but one is the producer of his own modification, all right. I tell them this is a fact, because now the fourth point starts. Because each substance is the doer and utilizer. Utilizer means enjoyer, karta and bhokta of its own modification. But this does not mean that you can affect any alteration in the sequence of, sequence is not written here, any alteration in the sequence of, you can add future reflections or future modifications as seen in the omniscience of the Supreme Being. So you have to add few words. Alterations in the sequence of this you add. Future is there already. Reflections is also there. After reflections, you can write modification, reflection oblique modification as seen in the omniscience of the Supreme Being. Okay. So this is the fourth point. So first was that nobody is the creator or doer of this universe. The second point, one substance does not do anything in the other substance. The third point is that the right believer also is not a doer of its own attachments or toxic disposition. And the fourth point says that each substance is the doer and utilizer of its own modification, but this does not mean that it can affect any alteration in the sequence of future modification as seen in the omniscience of the Supreme Being. Okay. So it is a doer and utilizer of its own modification, but not the changes in the sequence of the modification. So these are the four principles, and on this basis, the philosophy of inaction is being explained in Jainism. Now, further arguments. If one cannot affect any alterations, how does one remain the doer of his own modification? This is again a question from the ignorant being. Such doubts are raised by people because how can one who has regarded doing as making alteration only think ahead of this? They cannot think beyond this. They believe that doing something in the modification means changing the course of modification, changing the sequence of those modification. Is there no doing without making any changes? These are the questions. Is doing that which is not destined to happen called doing? Is it not doing due to what is destined to happen? These are some of the questions, and this leads to the another principle of swakartutva, sahaj kartutva, and akartutva. Three words have been used. Swakartutva. Swakartutva means doing one's own modification. The second one is easy doing. Easy doing means sahaj kartutva. Easy doing means that effortlessly doing. No efforts. Okay. Easy doing means effortlessly doing. Sahaj kartutva. And the third one is akartutva, non-doer. These three means the same. These three are synonyms. Whatever you call mean the same thing. When we say that Jain philosophy is that of inaction, the idea is that it is the principle of easy automatic doing. Easy automatic doing, sahaj kartutva, or self-doing, swakartutva. It does not believe in doing anything in the non-self of affecting alteration in substances. Okay. So one substance does everything in its own substance, but nothing in the non-self substances. Doing or happening with is mean the same thing. Whatever is to happen in the future will happen, and that means we shall do it with our efforts. Self-effort has not been discarded. There is no subservience. Subservience means dependence. There is no dependence. Everywhere there is complete independence. Each substance is independent of another substance. Each attribute is independent of another attribute. And each modification is independent of another modification. Everywhere there is complete independence. This includes all. All means all the 5 factors. The nature or स्वभाव, effort means पुरुषार्थ, future inevitability means destiny, bhavitavya, fruition of time means kal labdhi, and nimit, instrumental causes. All the 5 essentials are present. All the 5 samvai are present for any action to take place. It cannot happen that action has taken place and 5 out of 5 only 2 factors were there or 3 factors were there. No. For every action to perform, all the 5 causes will be there. Does the soul bring about its own modifications or not? In this context, Sri Kanji Swami explains as follows. This is taken from Atma Dharma magazine of March edition 1970. Question. Modifications are sequence bound. The modification of the soul also happen as bound to happen. As such, soul is not their producer. Is this correct? No. That the soul is not the producer of its own modification is not correct. The soul itself is the doer of all the sequence-bound modification that take their shape. However, it is necessary to understand here specially that the person who has faith in the sentience of the soul or who has arrived at the principle of sequence-bound modification does not assume modification of perverse faith. So the right believer does not have perverse faith, As such, he is the non-doer of perverse faith. Whatever soft attachments, etc. remain, he does not identify himself with them. He does not become a doer of those. He does not become an enjoyer of those. And he does not believe itself to be his own. That way, he is also a non-doer of attachment, etc. But is the creator of the pure modification of correct faith and consciousness. So this much doership is allowed, but everything else is not allowed for the right believer. We were talking about the right believer. So this is the summary of the whole Karta Karma Adhikar, the 4 points we discussed. Okay. The tenet or the principle of sequence-bound modification does not mean that modification take form without the soul being their doer. The sentient being assuming pure sentient modification is himself their doer, and non-sentient being assuming perverse modification is their doer. Okay. So the right believer is the doer of its own pure modifications, and the false believer is the doer of its impure modifications. Both are the doer. Thus, each substance is the doer of its own sequence-bound modification. This is the conclusion. Now the next module, module number 18. Again, there are 4 points. परिणमन करना वस्तु का सहज स्वभाव है. परिणमन करना means transformation. Transformation is easy doing, okay, of the nature of things. So every substance transforms every moment. There is not a single moment where the transformation does not happen. Okay. So each and every substance, soul and non-soul substance, all do their modification changes every moment, all the time. So we will read first and then I will highlight the 4 points. Very logical arguments have been given by Dr. Baharil ji here in this particular module. Okay, so who will read now? Aditi ji, you read.
Yes, sir.
Jayashree ji, can you, Rajeshri ji, can you do it? Can you enlarge it little bit? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, start. The same truth.
The same truth, if considered from the nature of things, will be arrived at, because modifications as continuity is in the nature of things. Whatever the nature of a substance, where is the need of others' cooperation in its being? If a substance stands in need of the help of others in the modification, what happens to the existence of nature? The word substance itself is an indicator of its own modification. Modifications are the general nature, easy and natural activity of the substance, without any reliance on others. When each substance takes forms itself, flows in its sequence bound current, assumes new shapes naturally and according to the sequence, where is the need to break the sequence? What obstruction is the nature of substances induces it to change its course? And why should it change? What is the need for changing its own course? When each modification of a substance takes form in its own time, how can it change it? As explained before, as many time units of all the past, present, and future times there are, so are the modifications of each substance, and each modification is engraved in each time unit. If one modification is removed from its place, that place will be vacant. Where from shall we get another modification to fill its place? If you want to bring a desirable modification and do so by removing it from its original place and time, will you then carry the modifications of this place there, which is an impossibility? Ultimately, why does not the world naturally accept the scheme of things? Why this craze for a change? Religion means acceptance of the nature of things with ease. Beginning of religion consists in the acceptance of the natural modifications of things. Such a person naturally has an inward vision. Those who accept easily the sequence bound modification of substances naturally start looking at their intrinsic nature. Such a balance exists in the nature of things. Like substance and its attributes, modifications also exist. Pravachan Sar verse 107 specially mentions this. If substance and its attribute exist in all the three tenses of time, modification exists for an indivisible part of the time. Just as the eternal existence of a substance and attributes cannot be challenged, in the same way, the existence in its own time of modifications cannot be challenged. But ignorant of substance and attributes, the persons with perverted faith have their eye on modifications only. They are entangled in their attempts to change modifications. It is only on account of this entanglement that their eye does not go to the self, and they cannot develop right faith. Scriptures term modification minded people as extroverts and substance minded people as introverts. To develop a vision of the self, it is necessary to accept the sequence of modifications. Modification is also true in its time. No change is possible in that also. When we have such a faith, vision becomes free of modifications and turns to the inherent nature of the self. Without a faith in the sequence-bound modification, it is impossible for the vision to be directed towards the inherent nature. Because of the burden of changing modifications, according to our desires remains on the mind. The vision, heavy with the burden of making changes in the scheme of things, has no power to look at its own nature. Entry into the self is not possible without being free from all the burdens completely. It has been said, with burden on our heads, it is not only difficult, but
Stop.
impossible.
Stop. So this is the end of 18th module. It is entry into the self is not possible without being free from all burdens completely. Okay, so here the 18th ends and the 19th begins. Okay, so there are 4 points. The first one is that this particular 18th module number 18 says that Parinaman means transformation. So it is the nature of thing that it transforms every moment. So it is its nature. And one thing about nature, you know, that nature is something that is always present. It never, 1 minute. It is always independent. Nature is always independent. Nature is never destroyed. It is always present. Nature is never incomplete, and nature is very spontaneous, natural. There is effortless. Okay. So these are some of the qualities of nature. And here the modification nature of the substance is being explained. So the first point is in the first paragraph itself, page number 47, last 2 lines. Modifications are the general nature, easy and natural activity. 1 minute. Modification are the general nature, easy and natural activity of the substance without any reliance on others. One minute. So we begin from the beginning. The same truth, if considered from the, so same truth means the acceptance of the sequence bound modification principle. The same truth, if considered from the nature of things, will be arrived at because modification as continuity is in the nature of things. So this is the nature of things, that modification is continuous. For never a moment the modification stops. It keeps on evolving and extinction. It keeps on evolving and extinction. So that is the nature of the modification. Whatever the nature of a substance, where is the need of others' cooperation in its being? Okay. So when it is in the nature of substance to modify every moment, where is the need of cooperation from other beings? If a substance stands in need of the help of others in its modification, what happens to the existence of nature? Right? Since the nature is always present, so the modification also happens every moment. Okay. So for modification to happen, the substance never needs any help or cooperation from any other substance. The word substance itself is an indicator of its own modification. So the word modification, the word substance, is an indicator of its own modification. Modification are the general nature, easy and natural activity of the substance without any reliance of others. So each substance has one attribute called Dravyatva Gun. The name of the gun is Dravyatva Gun. And because of this attribute, okay, every substance keeps on changing every moment. So to change every moment is the nature of substance. And that's why it is called Dravya. Dravya means Dravya. Dravya means transform. It transforms every moment. That's why the substance is called Dravya. When each substance takes forms itself, flows in its sequence-bound current, assumes new shape naturally and according to sequence, where is the need to break that sequence? When something is transforming on its own, flows in its own sequence-bound current, assumes new shape naturally without any help or interference from any other substance. And that also sequence bound. Where is the need to break that sequence? What obstruction is the nature? What obstruction in the nature of substance induces it to change its course? Means the arrangement of the transformation of the substance itself says that it is the nature of substances to change every moment. So there is no need to change that course, okay? And why should it change? What is the need of changing its own course? When each modification of a substance takes form in its own time, how can it change? So there is no way that it can change its own modification. This truth we have to accept. So this was the first point. Now the second point starts. As explained before,
I found two cards I found one card which is nice.
Aditi ji, you mute yourself.
Sorry.
Yeah. As explained before, this is the second point. As explained before, as many time units of all the past, present, and future times there are, so are the modification of each substance, and each modification is engraved in each time unit. So, there are many time units, means past, present, and future. So there are infinite time units, and each unit is engraved in each modification of the substance. So number of modification of each substance is equal to the total of all the time units. Okay? Past, present, and future all put together. So in one time unit, there is one modification of each substance. Now it is engraved. It cannot be changed. If one modification is removed from its place, that place will be vacant. Where from shall we get another modification to fill its place? If you want to bring a desirable modification and do so by removing it from its original place and time, will you then carry the modification of this place there, which is an impossibility. So in every time unit, one modification of substance is engraved, and this cannot be changed. Okay. So there is no possibility of any change in the sequence bound modification. This is the second point. The third point. Ultimately, why does not the, yeah, any questions?
Example?
Pardon?
Sir, can you give an example?
I can give you one example that yesterday we discussed about the tiles. You know, there are different tiles there is one tile beside another tile beside another tile on the floor of a room. Okay, so the whole surface is one only, but when we look at one tile, it is different from the second tile. Second is different from the third. So all the tiles that are fixed in this floor, that cannot be changed. Okay. Similarly, the modification also cannot be changed. Okay. Yesterday we discussed 6-7 examples that Bombay cannot be shifted in place of Kolkata and Kolkata cannot be shifted in place of Bombay. We are ready to accept that this cannot be done. But when it comes to modification, we believe that we can affect a change. And that is where the problem lies. So we have to accept that as we cannot change the place of Kolkata to Bombay and Bombay to Kolkata, similarly, we cannot change the modification of any substance. We cannot change the sequence. It will come on its own sequence. Then we also discussed the example of the reel of a cinema. Okay, as in the reel of a cinema, each scene is fixed, and also the sequence that it will appear on the screen is also fixed, and it cannot be changed. Similarly, sequence bound modification principle. In sequence bound modification principle, not a single alteration can be made in the sequence. Okay. Then we took an example of the staircase and the escalator. As in the staircase, each step is fixed on its place. And similarly, the sequence also is fixed. So you cannot alter anything in the staircase. You cannot alter anything in the escalator. It will flow on its own sequence. Okay. Similarly, in the substance modification, each modification is fixed on its place. It cannot be changed. Okay. So this is because we are discussing sequence bound modification, so we are discussing this from different angles, but the principle will remain same. The author wants to prove that no changes can be made in the modification of the substances in any manner. Okay. So if you remove one modification from one place, that place will become vacant. And to fulfill that place, you have to remove another modification from some different place. And if that is removed, then what will come in that place? So this is impossible to change any modification from its predestined place. Okay, this is what we have to accept. And the moment we accept it, we become relaxed. There is nothing on our head. We are only an observer, and be an observer. So the time until you remain an observer, you will never feel restless, anxiety, nothing. But the moment you become a doer, then the anxiety crops in, the stress crops in. Okay. So this is the second point. The third point. Ultimately, why does not the world naturally accept the scheme of things? Why does not accept? Why this craze for a change? Religion means acceptance of the nature of things with ease. Okay? Religion means acceptance of the nature of things with ease. No forceful. Just simply accept it, the sequence of the modification as they are. Because you are not a doer. So when you are not a doer, you have no other choice except acceptance. You have to accept as the nature of things as they are. Beginning of religion consists in the acceptance of the natural modification of things. Such a person naturally has an inward vision. So vision here means the faith or belief. Okay. Vision means drashti, and drashti here means faith or belief. Okay. Those who accept easily the sequence-bound modification of substance naturally start looking at their intrinsic nature. Such a balance exists in the nature of things. Okay. So who can accept the sequence-bound modification of substances? The one who is rational, the one who is a right believer, he can only accept the sequence-bound modification principle. And that person particularly starts looking at their intrinsic nature. Such a balance exists in the nature of things. Like substance and its attributes, modification also exists. So substance exists, attributes also exist, similarly modification also exists. But substance and attributes are eternally in existence. But modification exists for a moment only. But for a moment it exists. Okay. Pravachans are verse 107 specially mentions this. If substance and its attributes exist in all the three tenses of time, past, present, and future, modification exists for an indivisible part of time. Indivisible part means for one moment only, one samay. Just as the eternal existence of substance and attributes cannot be challenged, in the same way, the existence in its own time of modification cannot be challenged. So this was the third point. Now the fourth point starts. But ignorant of substance and attributes, the person with perverted faith, with wrong faith, But ignorant of substance and attributes, the persons with perverted faith have their eye on modification only. From time immortal, their vision or their belief is on the modification only. They never realize the substance. Okay. They are entangled in their attempts to change modification. Okay. They are entangled. They cannot come out of that vicious circle. Okay. They are entangled in their attempts to change modification. And reality is that they cannot change the sequence of modification. And their all efforts are meaningless. It is only on account of this entanglement that their eye does not go to the self, to the nature, to the substance, and they cannot develop right faith. Okay. Only mistake is that they are not ready to accept themselves as substances. They believe themselves to be modification, and they cannot remove their eye from this entanglement and does not go to the self. That is the only mistake. Scriptures term modification-minded people as extrovert, Bahiratma, and substance-minded people, Dravya Drashti wale ko, Antaratma, introverts. Okay. To develop a vision of the self, vision means belief. To develop a belief of the self, it is necessary to accept the sequence of modifications. Okay. If you want to look inward, you have to accept this sequence-bound modification. Modification is also true in its time. No change is possible in that also. Modification is also true in its time, means the sequence is also fixed and it cannot be altered. No change is possible in that also. When we have such a faith, vision becomes free of modification and turns to the inherent nature of the self. So when we have such a faith that we cannot alter the sequence of the modifications of substance, our vision becomes free of modification. So from time immortal, our faith was on the modification. Now it changes and moves towards the inherent nature of the self. Without a faith in the sequence-bound modification, it is impossible for the vision or the faith to be directed towards the inherent nature, because the burden of changing modification according to our desires remains on the mind, and he cannot become relaxed because he has the tension and the stress to keep on changing the modification, where in reality it cannot be changed. And the soul suffers because of this ignorance. The vision, heavy with the burden of making changes in the scheme of things, has no power or the capacity to look at its own nature. Entry into the self is not possible without being free from all burdens completely. Right? So now the next module, it will be explained. जिनके माथे भार वे डूबे मझधार में. Okay, so the one who believes that he can change the sequence of modification, he sinks or he drowns in the ocean. Okay, हम तो उतरे पार झोंके भार को भार में. And one who relieves himself from the burden of changes in modification, he crosses the ocean of sansar. Okay, so this will be explained in the next module, next week, Tuesday. The belief of the ignorant being that we are going to discuss in the 19th module. Okay, so our time is over today, so we will close. If you have any questions, quick questions, you can ask. Otherwise, yeah, Darshit, you have a question, ask.
Okay, basically this 19th module talks about perverted faith, and then there was on page 46 there was some explanation by Sri Kanji Swami. And I'm not very clear about it, because he says something about perverse. I'll just read the sentence. The principle of sequence-bound modifications does not assume modifications of perverse faith. Could you just clarify that a bit, please?
1 minute.
So it's on page 47 and 46 at the end.
Yeah, got it.
The confusion is coming for me because it says in the answer, the soul is not the producer of its own modifications, is not correct. Then it says the soul itself is the...
So in the previous module, we considered, discussed 4 points, right? Jain Darshan, why it is philosophy of inaction. So inaction means he is not the doer of anything in the non-self substances, first point. He is not the creator of the universe, second point. And the third is that although he is the doer of its own modification, but he is not the doer of the changes in the sequence of the modification. Okay, so that is what is being explained here by Swamiji. Okay. Modification or sequence bound, the modification of the soul also happens as bound to happen. As such, soul is not their producer. Is this correct? So if you want to take away the primary function of the substance, the nature of substance, that it changes every moment. So
Right.
if you take away this responsibility of changes happening every moment from the substance, then it becomes incorrect. So that is what being explained. No, that the soul is not the producer of his own modification is not correct. Because otherwise, who is the doer of those modifications? If the soul is not the doer, then who is the doer? Any other substance cannot do anything in the other substance. Okay, that is the principle. So the modification for anything to happen in this substance, the substance is the doer, the substance is the responsible person of that particular modification. Okay, so the soul is not the producer of its own modification is not correct. The soul itself is the doer of all the sequence bound modification that take their shape. However, it is necessary to understand here specially that the person who has faith in the sentience of the soul, means those who are right believer or who has arrived at the principle of sequence bound modification. That means who has become a right believer by accepting this principle does not assume modification of perverse faith. Now, if you have a right belief, simultaneously you cannot have a wrong belief. That is what is being explained here. Okay. So a person
Okay.
who is a right believer, he does not assume modification of perverse faith because he is a right believer. So he cannot be a right believer and wrong believer simultaneously. Either he is a right believer or he is a wrong believer. Okay. Since he is a right believer, he does not assume modification of perverse faith. Okay. As such, he is the non-doer of perverse faith. Whatever soft attachments, etc. remain, he does not identify himself with them. He is not a doer of those attachments also. Okay. So once he becomes a right believer, he stops being a doer of anything. Okay. That is what is being explained here.
So are we bringing
Understood?
Nishchay and Vyavahar into this as well? Into this?
Nischay and Vyavahar cannot be Nischay and Vyavahar can be applied in any statement. Okay.
Right.
So in this statement, from the real point of view, soul is the doer of its own modifications. Okay. This
Right.
is from the right, from the real point of view. From the conventional point of view, soul is the doer of modification of other substance also. So this is the
Right. Okay.
conventional viewpoint. Now here
Okay.
it is being discussed from the real point of view that whatever happens in this substance, that particular substance is responsible for everything that is happening in that substance. Okay. No other substance will do anything. So if he is a right believer, he cannot have wrong belief at the same time. Wrong believer believes that he can do anything in other substances or non-self substances. Okay. But
So this
since
is
he
where the
is a right
Purusharth part
believer,
comes in.
pardon?
This is where the Purusharth part comes in.
Yeah. So the Purusharth is, the effort is the right belief that he has manifested. Okay.
Right.
That is only the effort. And with that effort, he ceases to be a doer of anything, whether it is toxic emotions or attachments, whatever is being manifested in the modification, the right believer does not become a doer of all these modifications. Okay.
Okay.
So that is what being explained here.
Okay, I've got it. Thank you.
And since
Sorry,
this
sir.
is karta karma adhikar of Samaysar, so then the last question that we discussed, that then what is the doer? Then right believer is the doer of what things? So then it says that he is the doer of the pure sentiments or the pure modifications. Okay. If you want to establish doership of the right believer, then he is the doer of pure modifications of correct faith and consciousness.
Okay.
Hmm.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and anyone else?
Jai Jinendra, sir.
Yeah.
So, sir, just to make sure I understand it also correctly, the right belief is just to understand that the soul is the doer of the Shuddh and Ashuddh Bhav.
No. If a right believer, if he is a right believer, how can he be a doer of Ashuddh Bhav?
So, because it says like the modification in the soul, soul is a
Huh?
doer of its own modification.
Yes, correct.
So, sir, that modification can be good or bad.
Yeah. So he does not become a doer of bad modifications. He's a right believer, no? So right believer, if you want to say what is the function of what kind of modification does a right believer do, then we will say that he is the doer of only pure modifications.
So, sir, when the impure modifications take place, like, for example, when we
Toxic
engage in
emotions.
passions, yeah, toxic emotions
Yeah.
like anger or, pride, those kinds of things. So, they are getting manifested in the soul.
Right. Not
So,
in
sir,
the soul, in the modification of the soul, okay?
in
Modification of
the
the substance.
in the modification
Substance.
of the
Of the
sub
soul substance.
of the soul substance, but then,
Right.
sir, the soul
Hmm.
is getting affected, no? Because the soul is getting modified in that
Soul is getting
period.
modified, that is sure, but if he becomes a doer, then he gets affected. If he remains an observer, then he's not affected because observing is his true nature. So if you remain as your true nature, then then you are not being affected. If you become a
So,
doer, then you become affected.
so, sir, for example, like if someone is getting angry,
Hmm.
and then so they are just observing themselves getting angry, but internally they know that the soul cannot be angry. Is that right?
So, right believer in the fourth stage, fifth stage, he will have these toxic emotions, right?
Yeah.
But he does not become a doer of that. Although the toxic emotions are manifesting in his own modification, right? But he does not become a doer of those toxic emotions. And the wrong believer becomes the doer of toxic emotions. And that's why he is a wrong believer. And right believer does not become doer of toxic emotions. Although these toxic emotions are manifesting in his own modification, but he never becomes a doer.
So,
there
when we
is
say
the
it's there, it's sorry. So when we say like he's a doer, um, wrong belief. So it means like the person is thinking that I am the one creating this. Because in sequence, if we talk about this topic, the person was meant to get angry because
Right,
that's how it was written.
right,
So in that moment, the person will feel like, the negative passions
right.
because it was already meant to happen. So in that state, the modification is already taking place in the soul. So now, when all these things are happening, for the right believer to distinguish between right believer and wrong believer, does it mean like the wrong believer will
Become a
kind of like,
doer.
so how will he become a doer? That's not what I'm clear about. Like, he's anyways, the
So,
modification is
so
getting
the
angry.
anger is happening on its own, but this fellow wrong believer believes that he is doing the anger. And the right believer believes that he is not the doer of toxic emotions, anger.
Okay.
So this is
Okay.
only the difference. The right believer does not become a doer, and the wrong believer becomes a doer. That is the basic
Okay.
difference.
Okay,
It
so it's
does not
almost
mean that you become a right believer and the pride and anger will not happen. It's not like that. It will happen up
okay.
to 10th stage. Even a monk also has these passions, Up to the 10th stage, the passion will remain. 10th stage of spiritual development. Gunasthan, 10th Gunasthan, okay? So in the 4th, he
Okay.
becomes a right believer. 5th, he become a Shravak. 6th, 7th, he becomes a monk. Then 8th, 9th, 10th is monk. Up to the 10th stage, the passions will be there. But he does not become a believer. So he does not become a doer. So he's not disturbed.
Okay.
You
So
only
that's
get
the
disturbed when
Purusharth.
you become a doer. Right.
Okay. Okay. And so this thing is the Purusharth which will
Mhm.
help us.
Yes. So you have to understand the primary functions of the soul. Soul is by nature observer. Okay. Observer of what? Observer of everything that is being manifested in its modification. Okay. He's an observer. Right. So just because this is a karta karma adhikar, here particularly, it is being mentioned that a right believer becomes a doer of its pure modification. Okay? Right believer becomes a doer of only pure modification. He does not become doer of impure modification. He believes that impure modification belongs to matter substance.
Okay.
So
Okay.
this is
Okay.
the
So
only
that's how he's the doer of the pure
pure.
modification, because
Right,
he
right.
thinks that
If you want
my
to,
soul.
if you want to put doership to a right believer, then he is doer of only pure modification. And
Okay.
when we consider this from the 8th point of view, 8th nahi, param shuddh nischay nahi. Okay. Supreme real point of view. From the supreme real point of view, he is not a doer of pure modification also.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
So
Thank you,
it
sir.
depends from which perspective that the things are being said. Okay. So if it is from a supreme real point of view, he is not a doer of pure modification also. Impure modification, anyways, he is not doing. But from the supreme point of view, he is not a doer of pure modifications also. But here he is a right believer, and here we are discussing what the right believer does. So then we can say that he is a doer of pure modification only and not impure modification. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. निज निधि निज में बताई, यह अनंत उपकार है उसके लिए जिन वाणी माँ को वंदना सत बार है, उसके लिए जिन वाणी माँ को वंदना सत